When you don't call back and you don't have a promise, all you can do is await. Alright, welcome back to this hopefully very promising intermediate JavaScript episode on promises and async await. As always, all the material for this episode can be found on my GitHub, link in the description. This episode, we will be going into this number 6 folder, promises and async. And we will be opening up promises and async.html, which will look something like this. Now, the main function call we'll be handling is called Magicalfetch, which is returning a string that looks a little something like this. It's a string of an object with a list attribute and then just an array. And what we'll be going over is kind of simulating getting a response from the server, processing the information you get, and doing something with it. Now, to do that, we're using these building block functions: string to JSON, get list from JSON, getting the list out of there, and then get sum from list. Finally, handle your new total. Now, I will say, while I was preparing for this episode, I was going through the material as if I was teaching myself when I was first learning a lot of this stuff. But what I kind of realized is when I was learning, we didn't have promises. And so callback hell was essentially how you were dealing with a lot of these things. And I don't necessarily know if that's as big a problem now when learning as it was when I did. So I'll go over callback hell and why JavaScript developed these tools to handle these complex problems. But I don't specifically see callback hell being as much of a problem now, and more just people needing to better understand promises and async await. Now, callback hell essentially arises from needing to chain functionality that you want divided into separate functions and run those functions off of asynchronous information. And the thing is, common functionality should be divided into separate functions. Especially in a larger app, you might need to handle getting a sum from a list in multiple areas from different data sources. And so you don't want to repeat that same code in a bunch of different places. So you stick it in a function that can be called from everywhere. The real problem is that JavaScript wasn't initially designed to handle asynchronous code very well. And the thing is, it would be great if you could just say, get Magicalfetch, give me the information, and then do string to JSON, and then do get list from JSON. But the problem is, what if Magicalfetch takes 10 seconds and you're completely blocking the call stack? There just wasn't an easy way around it. As I said, JS was ill-equipped to handle complex workflows. So you ended up with code like this that did the job, but it's very, very ugly. And this is a very tame example. If you just Google callback hell, you'll see a million images on Google. But if we run this, you see that it starts, and a second later, a new total has been retrieved. It gives you the sum of all of these numbers added up together in the array. And so handling this kind of functionality was annoying to deal with for a while, but it was doable. And what really changed things up was the idea of promises. Now, essentially what a promise does is it says, keep going with whatever you need to do next, and just tell me how to handle the expected information when you get it. I promise it'll get there. So we can see here, we're saying Magicalfetch dot then, whenever that data finally arrives, then turn the string into a JSON. You can then return that information, and whatever gets returned is just passed to the next then get list from JSON, then get the sum from JSON list, and so on. Also, if something goes wrong, you have the ability to catch errors. So then here, if something were to go wrong, we've got the error and we can just log that out as an error. Promises were introduced to alleviate the stress of working with chained workflow. It allows for a flatter and clearer order of calls. The syntax is somewhat of a mix of callbacks and standard synchronous code. You can see it's definitely one after another, but you've still got things in parentheses and kind of shifted over. So there's definitely some kind of learning curve to getting the hang of it. But if we run a promise of something new, you'll see we get the exact same kind of functionality. It's starting the promise. After a second, it's returning the value. And now what that promise takes is a function. And that function takes 2 arguments. The first argument, which is normally called resolve, is the function that you're going to call if things go well, passing on whatever information you want to pass on. If you do something and things break, you can always call reject. Like I said, these names are convention. You could name this whatever you want and just make sure that when you get to the end of the function, if things went well, you're going to call piss off. So instead of giving a return value, all I'm doing is saying resolve. And if I want to resolve by passing the value 5, I can do that. And I can then say const a is set to this new promise. And then I can say a.then take a value. And console log that value. And there you get 5. Now another example of that can be found in our Magicalfetch. So what we're doing is first defining our dummy data. So if there's a callback, set a timeout and call that callback, passing in the dummy data after a second. And regardless, we're going to return a new promise that can either resolve or reject. And in our case, we're waiting a second and then resolving with the dummy data, which then, where we handle our promise, we're saying then string to JSON. And string to JSON, if we look up here, is parsing that and then returning it. And that's the same pattern that all of these functions are doing. If they have a callback, pass the callback, but regardless, return the information from whatever that function does. So we can return our JSON from the string, and then return our list from JSON, and then return the sum from the list. And at the end, we can handle our new total. A lot of times, this handle new might be updating the DOM. So we wait until the data comes from the server, we process that data, and once we have that new total, we can make it available to the user to see. And so like I said, it works well, but it does take some getting used to. And although you can write promises, I wouldn't say it's the most common thing to do. And that's where Async Await comes in. Async Await allows for asynchronous code with a synchronous looking syntax. It's purely syntactic sugar on top of promises. They go hand in hand. You can write an async function to handle a promise. All you have to do is define a function as async, and you're allowed to use await to await promises. So in this example here, we have this async function, async in the whole, and then we're awaiting our Magicalfetch. Now, when it arrives, then we move on to the next line. Now you might be wondering, isn't that exactly what you said we couldn't do before that led to callback hell? Well, yes. And the key thing here is this async function. None of this would work if async in the whole would just block the next function from being called after it. What happens here is when we call async in the whole, we're essentially processing the logic as if it were handling a promise. And so this async in the whole will be called and then just move on to the next thing after it. And after a second, then we'll handle whatever comes back from Magicalfetch, just like any other promise. So we'll take this data string and then we'll string to JSON and then get list from JSON, etc. At the end, we're handling this new total. Now, instead of using .catch here, like in a promise, in async await functions, all you're doing is wrapping the code in a try catch. So you're going to say, try all of this. If anything breaks, we'll catch. You also have the option for finally. Now, I left it here. In promises, it can be a little wonky. So if you want to look into it, you're free to. But if you want to do something finally at the end, and in general, I would just use async await over promises because I think it's both easier and clearer to read, especially on a team. Now, this extra finally is great, especially when it comes to making calls to the server, where you want to show a loading icon while the data is loading, and at the end, you want to get rid of that loading icon. Before you make the call, you can make that loading icon visible, but the problem is always that if the call's successful, you want to turn it off, and even if there's an error, you still want to turn it off. And so this finally gives you the ability to say, when you're finally done, whether things go well or poorly, run whatever's in here. And that's where we see finally done with async. So if we run this async in the whole, we see the same functionality as before. We start it, we see there's this promise, a second later, a new total has been retrieved, 172. Finally done with async, you see is called after that. Now, if we want to run all of these examples together, let's first clear this off and run it. You see here that they're all starting, and then starting, and a second later, they're getting their responses. Now, just some final things to note. In our case, our examples are running the same way, but this isn't always 100% the case. Technically, promises defer action to the microtask queue, which is not something that we actually covered in the event loop episode. It's something that basically won't affect you. I think I'm going to do a video on it regardless because I think it's really interesting and I've been looking a lot more into it recently. But for all intents and purposes, all you have to really remember is that promises and async await are essentially your path to salvation out of callback hell. So I hope you found the information in this episode useful. If you did, feel free to give the episode a like. Feel free to subscribe if you haven't. And if you think I went too slowly or too quickly on anything, feel free to leave a comment. Leave a comment regardless if you want to. It helps grow the channel. So I think that'll do it for today. I hope you guys got something out of it, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks.